What if the most influential figure in American history wasn't a president, a general, or a founding father? What if it was a god? A brutal, blood-soaked deity from an ancient empire, whose symbol of conquest is so deeply embedded in the fabric of the United States that you see it every single day, and have no idea what you're looking at. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is the story of a forgotten national hero, a divine ancestor whose shadow stretches from the marble halls of ancient Rome to the corridors of power in Washington, D.C. He was the protector, the avenger, and the father of the most dominant empire the world had ever seen. And the Romans believed that as long as they honored him, they were invincible. But they built their faith on a terrifying secret, a secret about his true nature, a power so raw and primal it terrified even the other gods. So the question is not just who he was, but what was the source of his incredible power, and how did a 2,000-year-old symbol for war become a quiet, hidden cornerstone of modern America? To understand this, you have to forget everything you think you know about the god of war. Erase the image of the Greek god Ares, the hot-headed, impulsive brute who was little more than a cosmic bully. The Greeks despised Ares. He was a coward, a winner, a representation of the chaotic, senseless slaughter of battle. He was an antagonist in their myths, often defeated, humiliated by heroes and even by other gods. He was everything the Greeks, with their love of philosophy and logic, rejected. The Romans saw something entirely different. Their god Mars was not a reckless thug. He was discipline. He was strategy. He was the embodiment of military virtue, and the divine guarantor of their empire's destiny. While the Greeks saw Ares as the horror of war, the Romans saw Mars as the glory of it. He wasn't just a god they worshipped. He was the god they sought to become. He was their father, literally. But to find the true source of his power, we have to travel back even further, before the first cobblestone of Rome was ever laid, before the legions, before the eagles, before the empire. In the misty hills of pre-Roman Italy, Mars was not a god of war at all. He was a god of the earth, an agricultural spirit named Maris, who watched over the fields, protected the livestock, and ensured the spring thaw brought new life. He was a guardian, a protector of the boundaries of the farm, warding off disease from the cattle and blight from the crops. The early farmers would walk the perimeter of their land in a solemn procession, chanting his name, asking him to create a divine shield against wolves, crop failure, and famine. He was the untamed virile energy of nature itself, the force that pushed the green shoot through the hard soil. This is the first critical secret of Mars. His power wasn't born on the battlefield. It was born in the dirt. He was first and foremost a protector of the people's livelihood. And as these small farming villages grew into a city, and that city grew into a republic, Mars grew with them. His domain simply expanded. He was no longer just protecting the fields, he was protecting the state. The enemies were no longer wolves and blight, but rival armies and foreign kings. His fundamental nature never changed. He was, and always would be, Rome's great protector. This primal elemental power is reflected in the bizarre and violent story of his birth. Unlike most gods who were the product of a divine union, Mars was born of pure rage. The poet Ovid tells us the story. Jupiter, the king of the gods, had given birth to Minerva, the goddess of wisdom, by himself. She sprang fully formed from his head. His wife, the goddess Juno, was consumed with jealousy and fury. Enraged that Jupiter could create a child without her, she declared that she would do the same. She traveled to the edge of the world to find the goddess Flora, a deity of flowers and spring. Flora presented Juno with a magical flower, one so potent that a single touch could cause a woman, mortal or divine, to conceive. Juno, in her fury, touched the flower to her womb and was instantly filled with the child of her own rage. That child was Mars. He was not born of love or lust or even a strategic alliance. He was conceived from pure, unadulterated vengeance. He was his mother's fury made flesh. This is why he was different. He didn't have the mixed allegiances or complex parentage of the other Olympians. He was a singular, focused force of nature. He was the storm, the earthquake, the wildfire, a power that could not be reasoned with, only unleashed. And it was this untamed power that would father an empire. The Romans didn't just see Mars as a protector. They saw him as their physical ancestor, the progenitor of their entire race. The story is one of the most famous in history. In the ancient city of Alba Longa, a princess named Rhea Silvia was a Vestal virgin, A priest is sworn to a 30-year vow of celibacy in service to the goddess Vesta. Her uncle, the king, had forced her into the priesthood to ensure she would produce no heirs who could challenge his throne. But a god is not bound by the laws of men. One day, as Rhea Silvia slept by the banks of the Tiber River, the god Mars descended. Overcome by her beauty, he came to her, and from their union she conceived twin sons. When the cruel king discovered her pregnancy, he was furious. He ordered the infants to be thrown into the river to drown, but the servant tasked with the grim duty took pity on them. He placed them in a basket and set them adrift on the flooded river, hoping for a miracle. The river god, Tiberinus, guided the basket to the shore, where it came to rest at the base of a fig tree. There, the abandoned sons of a god were found by a she-wolf, a creature sacred to Mars himself. The Lupa, as she was known, suckled the infants, saving them from starvation until they were discovered by a shepherd, who raised them as his own. These boys, of course, were Romulus and Remus, and Romulus would go on to found a small city on the Palatine Hill, a city that would one day rule the known world. A city he named Rome. This wasn't just a charming fireside tale for the Romans. This was their declaration of independence and their book of Genesis rolled into one. It was historical fact, a divine truth that shaped their entire worldview. They were the children of Mars. War was not just something they did, it was in their blood. Their right to conquer was a birthright, handed down from their divine father. This belief gave every Roman soldier, from the lowest legionary to the highest general, a sense of sacred purpose. They weren't just fighting for land or for gold. They were fighting to fulfill the destiny laid out for them by their creator. The very first month of the Roman calendar was not January, but Martius, March, named in his honor. This was the month when the snows melted, the fields could be planted, and the season of war could begin anew. Every aspect of Roman civic and military life revolved around him. Outside the sacred boundary of the city was a massive field, the Campus Martius, the field of Mars. Here the Roman army trained, drilled, and prepared for battle. It was where soldiers were consecrated before a campaign and where victorious generals returned in triumph, parading their spoils and captives on their way to the Temple of Jupiter. It was the training ground for empire, a patch of land dedicated to the brutal art of conquest, all under the watchful eye of the nation's father. But their devotion went far beyond naming months and fields after him. To fuel their unparalleled military machine, the Romans fed their gods' hunger with rituals and sacrifices so dark, so precise, and so bloody, they reveal the terrifying bargain they made for power. A pact written in blood that promised them the world, but demanded a constant, violent price. To understand this pact, you must first stand in the dust of ancient Rome and smell the air, thick with incense and iron. The Romans believed the gods weren't distant observers. They were active, demanding business partners. And the currency of their business was sacrifice. Not just a prayer whispered into the wind, but a precise physical transaction. The most potent of these was the Suiviturilia, a ritual so foundational to Roman life it was etched into their monuments. Picture it. A procession, solemn and purposeful, moving through the fields or around the city walls. Leading the way are three animals, the pinnacle of Roman livestock, each one perfect, without blemish. A pig, a sheep, and a towering bull. They are led by priests in white robes, their faces grim with concentration. This isn't a celebration. It's a spiritual cleansing on a statewide scale. The animals are paraded around the area to be purified, forming a magical, protective barrier. Then, with practiced, unflinching hands, the priests perform the sacrifice. The blade flashes, blood spills onto the consecrated earth, and the life force of the animals is released, offered up to Mars. But what did this gruesome pageant actually achieve? In the Roman mind, it was a reset button. They believed that communities, armies, and even the land itself could accumulate a kind of spiritual stain, a negative energy called piaculum, through misdeeds, broken oaths, or simple bad luck. This stain angered the gods and invited disaster, plague, famine, military defeat. The Suiviturilia was the ultimate detergent. The blood of the three animals washed away the stain, restoring the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods. It was a plea to Mars not just as a warrior but as a guardian. Protect our fields, Mars, so they may be fertile. Protect our city, Mars, so it may be safe. Protect our soldiers, Mars, so they may be victorious. It was a ritual performed before a major military campaign, to purify the army and after, to cleanse it of the blood it had spilled. It was a promise made and a debt paid, a demonstration that Rome understood the cosmic rules and was willing to play by them, no matter the cost. But the Romans' devotion to Mars could get far stranger and far more specific. Every year on the Ides of October 15th, a terrifyingly primal ritual unfolded. This was the sacrifice of the October horse. As the campaigning season ended and the legions returned home, a chariot race was held in the Campus Martius, the Field of Mars. The race itself was a thrill, but the real event came after. The right-hand horse of the winning team, still panting, still gleaming with the sweat of victory, was immediately speared and sacrificed to the god of war. Its life, in its moment of ultimate triumph, was given to Mars as a thank you for the season's victories. And then things got even more bizarre. The horse's head was severed. Instantly, a frantic, ritualized struggle erupted between the residents of two of Rome's oldest neighborhoods. They fought tooth and nail for the honor of displaying the bloody trophy. If one side won, they'd nail the head to the wall of the Regia, the ancient home of kings. If the other side won, it was mounted on a rival tower. Meanwhile, the horse's tail was cut off and rushed, still dripping blood, to the Regia, where the Vestal virgins would allow the blood to fall onto the sacred hearth of the city, preserving its power for purification rituals in the coming year. This wasn't just a sacrifice. It was a pure injection of martial energy back into the heart of the state. It was chaotic, competitive, and violent, a perfect reflection of the god it honored. It was a reminder that victory was not a given. It had to be earned, celebrated with blood, and its essence literally captured and stored to ensure future success. This was the Roman mindset. The spiritual and the physical were inseparable. The favor of Mars wasn't one with quiet contemplation. It was one with action, with spectacle, with the raw, undeniable reality of a sacrificed champion. And who were the men charged with orchestrating this divine communication? Not just any priests. Mars had his own dedicated college of warrior priests, the Salii, or the Leaping Priests. Twice a year in March and October, marking the beginning and end of the war season, a sight would stop Romans in their tracks. A dozen men, dressed in the archaic armor of a long-dead era, would dance through the streets. They carried ancient bronze shields, called encilia, and short swords. As they moved, they leaped, they chanted, they spun in a hypnotizing warlike dance, rhythmically striking their shields with their blades. The sound must have been incredible, a clanging, reverberating, metallic heartbeat echoing through the stone city. They were a living link to Rome's mythic past. Legend said that the original Ancili had fallen from the heavens as a gift from the gods, a divine promise that as long as the shield remained safe, Rome would be invincible. To safeguard this precious artifact, the king had 11 perfect copies made, so no enemy could ever identify and steal the original. The Salii were the guardians of this promise, and their dance was a ritual awakening. They weren't just praying to Mars, they were rousing him, calling him forth from his winter slumber to march with the legions, and then in the fall, lulling him back to rest. This sacred theater played out across the god's own turf, the Campus Martius. The Field of Mars wasn't just a name, it was his property. This vast, open floodplain outside the city's sacred boundary was where the Roman state engaged with the world of organized violence. Here the army drilled and trained. Here the census was taken, counting the citizens fit for military duty. It was a space that was deliberately outside the formal city, a place where the raw power of the military could be assembled without threatening the civil order within the walls. Before a general led his army to war, he would go to the Temple of Mars altar, the Avenger, and personally shake the sacred spears kept within, crying out, "Mars Vigila! Mars, wake up!" It was a personal, direct appeal. The general wasn't just a commander. He was the temporary embodiment of the god's will. And when he returned victorious, it was across the Field of Mars that he would ride in his triumph, parading his spoils and his captives before the cheering citizens, on his way to the Temple of Jupiter to give thanks. The entire life cycle of a Roman war, from preparation to bloody execution to glorious conclusion, was bookended by rituals to Mars, performed on his own sacred ground. This reveals the fundamental genius of the Roman relationship with their war god. They recognized he had two faces, two appetites. There was Mars Gradivus, the marcher, the striding god of the battlefield who thrived on disciplined violence and demanded victory. This was the Mars of the legions, the god of imperial expansion. But there was also Mars Silvanus, the guardian of the forests and fields. This was the Mars of the farmer, the protector of boundaries, the ward against blight, wolves, and disease. The Roman citizen, for most of the Republic's history, was both a soldier and a farmer. In the spring, he would leave his plow, pick up his sword, and march to war as a legionary. In the fall, he would return, put down his sword, and pick up his scythe to bring in the harvest. His entire existence balanced on this razor's edge between creation and destruction. Mars was the only god who understood both sides of his life. He was the divine patron of the man who fed the state and the man who defended it. This duality made him more than a god of war. He was the god of Roman survival itself. He wasn't an external force they prayed to for help. He was the divine reflection of their own identity. He was fierce, practical, disciplined, and utterly relentless. He was the perfect god for a people determined to conquer the world, not through sheer chaotic rage, but through unwavering, systematic, sanctified force. But this uniquely Roman hero was a radical reinvention. To truly grasp how revolutionary he was, we have to look at his origins, at the god he used to be. Because before he was Mars, the father of Rome, he was Ares, the Greek god of war, a figure so despised, so reviled, that even his own father Zeus wished he had never been born. To understand the Greek mindset, you have to understand this: they had two gods of war. Two. And they couldn't have been more different. One was revered, celebrated, the brilliant mind behind every great victory, the protector of civilization itself. The other was Ares. Ares wasn't the god of strategy. He wasn't the god of noble sacrifice or defending the homeland. He was the god of bloodlust. He was the embodiment of the frantic, screaming, adrenaline-fueled chaos of the battlefield. He was the stench of gore, the sound of breaking bones, the sheer unthinking rage that turns men into beasts. And the Greeks, for the most part, hated him for it. His own father, Zeus, king of the gods, says it best in Homer's Iliad. After Ares is wounded in battle and comes crying to Olympus for sympathy, Zeus looks at his son with pure contempt and says, "Do not sit beside me and whine, you two-faced liar. To me you are the most hateful of all the gods who hold Olympus. Forever quarreling is dear to your heart, wars and battles. If you had been born of some other god, you would have been down under the Titans long ago." Think about that. The most powerful being in the universe tells his own son that the only reason he hasn't been thrown into the eternal prison of Tartarus is because of who his mother is. It's one of the most brutal takedowns in all of mythology. Zeus despised him not just because he was violent. Zeus himself was no stranger to violence, but because Ares' violence was pointless. It was chaotic, undisciplined, and driven by ego. Ares didn't fight for a cause, he fought for the sake of fighting. He would switch sides in a battle on a whim just to keep the slaughter going. He was the divine equivalent of a bar brawler who smashes a bottle over someone's head for looking at him the wrong way. His sister Athena was the other god of war. But she was everything he wasn't. If Ares was the wild swing of a club, Athena was the precision strike of a sniper. She represented strategy, tactics, and the wisdom to know when to fight and why. She was the patron of heroes like Odysseus, men who won battles with their minds as much as their swords. The Greeks built magnificent temples to Athena, most famously the Parthenon, a jewel of civilization that still stands today. And Ares? He had a few minor temples, mostly in militaristic states like Sparta, but in Athens, the heart of Greek culture, his place of worship wasn't a grand temple. It was a hill, a rocky outcrop outside the main city called the Areopagus, or Ares' Rock. And it wasn't a place of worship so much as a courthouse for murder trials. The story of how that hill got its name is one of the few myths where Ares isn't portrayed as a complete monster or a buffoon. His daughter Alcippe was assaulted by a son of Poseidon. Ares, in a fit of paternal rage, found the man and killed him on the spot. Poseidon was furious and demanded justice. So the gods convened a trial, the very first murder trial, right there on that hill. Ares stood accused. He laid out his case, arguing that his actions were justified vengeance for the violation of his daughter. And in a shocking turn of events, the gods acquitted him. It's a rare glimpse of another side of Ares, a protective, almost noble fury. But even this moment of justice is rooted in brutal, personal violence, not in law or order. For the most part, however, the stories about Ares are stories of his humiliation. His affair with Aphrodite, the goddess of love, is a perfect example. Aphrodite was unhappily married to Hephaestus, the lame and gritty god of the forge. She and Ares carried on a passionate, reckless affair, thinking they were clever enough to hide it. But Helios, the sun god, who sees everything, saw them together and immediately went to tell the cuckolded husband. Hephaestus was a master craftsman, not a warrior. He knew he couldn't challenge the god of war to a physical fight, so he used his own gifts. He forged an incredible net, as fine as a spider's web but as strong as adamant, and rigged it above his marriage bed. Then he told Aphrodite he was leaving for a while. As soon as he was gone, Ares snuck in, and just as they were in the throes of passion, the net dropped, trapping them naked and helpless. But Hephaestus didn't just want to catch them, he wanted to shame them. He threw open the doors to his bedroom and called all the other gods to come and see. Apollo, Hermes, Poseidon, they all crowded in, pointing and laughing at the god of war and the goddess of love, tangled together in their shame. It was the ultimate humiliation. Ares, the embodiment of hypermasculine aggression, was reduced to a public laughingstock, a punchline in a divine comedy. His performance in the Trojan War was even worse. This was his Super Bowl, the greatest conflict of the age, and he was a disaster. He initially sided with the Trojans, but he wasn't a brilliant general. He was just an instigator flying over the battlefield, screaming and driving men to madness. At one point, he faces off against the mortal Greek hero Diomedes. Now, a mortal fighting a god should be no contest. But Diomedes is being guided by Athena. She cloaks him in mist, sharpens his senses, and tells him exactly where to strike. Diomedes hurls his spear, and with Athena's help, it pierces Ares' side. The god of war, the immortal personification of battle, shrieks in pain. Homer says he bellowed with the sound of 10,000 men and fled the battlefield, a trail of divine blood or ichor behind him. He flies back to Olympus, a coward, to complain to his father, which is when Zeus delivers that soul-crushing speech. He is literally wounded by a mortal and runs home crying to Daddy. This is the Greek Ares. A bully, a coward, a winner, a figure of ridicule. He represented everything the Greeks found terrifying and distasteful about war. The chaos, the lack of control, the mindless brutality that strips away humanity. They respected the necessity of war, but they didn't glorify the bloodlust that came with it. They glorified the heroes who fought with courage, intelligence, and for a cause greater than their own ego. Ares represented none of that. He was a necessary evil, a force of nature to be appeased, but never to be admired. He was the problem, not the solution. So how? How does this despised, humiliated, incompetent god of chaotic slaughter cross the sea from Greece to Italy and become something completely different? How does this divine failure, this cosmic joke, transform into Mars, the revered father of the Roman people, the symbol of their strength, the bedrock of their entire civilization? The Romans didn't just give him a new name, they gave him a new soul. They looked at this raw, untamed force of violence and saw not a liability but potential. They saw the raw energy they needed to forge an empire, and they decided to refine it, to discipline it, and to aim it like a weapon at the heart of the world. The transformation from Ares to Mars isn't just a name change. It's one of the most successful rebranding campaigns in human history. And it all started with a she-wolf, a pair of twins, and a destiny written in blood. The story begins not in a palace, but in a prison of piety. In the ancient Italian kingdom of Alba Longa, a king named Numitor is overthrown by his own brother, the ruthless Amulius. To secure his stolen throne, Amulius knows he must extinguish Numitor's bloodline. He murders Numitor's sons, but for his niece Rhea Silvia, he devises a crueler fate. He forces her to become a Vestal virgin, a priestess sworn to the goddess Vesta under a sacred vow of celibacy for 30 years. To break that vow was a death sentence, to be buried alive. Amulius smiled, confident that no child of hers would ever rise to challenge him. He had locked away the future, but he made one fatal miscalculation. He forgot that the gods do not care for the locks of men. One day, as Rhea Silvia went to a sacred grove to draw water for a ritual, a shadow fell over her. The sun darkened, the air grew heavy, and there, emerging from the twilight of the woods, was a figure of terrifying majesty. Some versions of the story say he came to her in a dream, a vision of overwhelming power. Others say he appeared in the flesh, his armor gleaming, his eyes burning with a divine fire. It was Mars, the god of untamed nature, of virility, of war itself. He saw the daughter of a king, a woman whose future had been stolen, and in her, he saw the vessel for a new and terrible destiny. He came upon her, and she, a consecrated virgin, conceived. The god of war had just fathered the founders of the world's greatest military empire. When the signs of her pregnancy became undeniable, Rhea Silvia's fate was sealed. She tried to claim divine parentage, a desperate plea that fell on the deaf ears of her uncle. For Amulius, this was not a miracle, it was a threat. He threw her in a dungeon, and upon the birth of two healthy, impossibly strong twin boys, his fear curdled into rage. He couldn't risk letting the sons of Mars live. He ordered a servant to take the infants to the Tiber River and cast them into the raging current to drown. A quick, clean end to a dangerous prophecy. But here again, fate, or perhaps the boy's divine father, intervened. The Tiber was swollen from heavy rains, its banks overflowing. The servant, unable to reach the main current and perhaps moved by a flicker of pity, placed the twins in a small wicker basket and set it afloat in the shallowest part of the floodwater. He watched as the tiny ark bobbed precariously, convinced the river would still claim them. But it didn't. As the floodwaters receded, the basket didn't drift out to be destroyed. It gently came to rest on the shore, snagged in the roots of a wild fig tree at the base of what would one day be called the Palatine Hill. The infants cried, their wails echoing in the wilderness. And something heard them. Not a human, but a creature of Mars himself. A great she-wolf, driven from the hills by thirst, came down to the river to drink. She was drawn by the sound, and when she found the two helpless babies, a divine instinct overrode her predatory nature. This was the famous Lupa of Rome. Instead of tearing them apart, she lowered her head and began to gently lick them clean. She nudged them towards her, and the sons of the war god, Romulus and Remus, began to nurse from a wolf. It's an image so primal, so potent, it's burned into the very soul of Western civilization. Human civilization being nurtured by the raw, untamed wild. A woodpecker, another animal sacred to Mars, was said to have brought them morsels of food, completing the scene of divine protection. This is where the story could have ended, with two feral children raised by beasts. But destiny required a human hand. A shepherd of the king, a man named Faustulus, was tending his flock nearby when he saw the incredible sight. A wolf nursing two human infants. He was stunned, but he recognized the hand of the gods at work. He carefully took the boys, scaring the she-wolf away, and brought them home to his wife, Acca Laurentia. They named them Romulus and Remus and raised them as their own sons, never speaking a word of how they were found. The boys grew up not as princes but as peasants. They were hardened by the sun, their muscles toned by work and rough living, but their divine bloodline couldn't be concealed. They were taller, stronger, and fiercer than any of the other shepherd boys. They possessed a natural charisma, an innate authority that drew others to them. They didn't just lead the other shepherds, they commanded them. They became the leaders of a gang of youths, defending their flocks from wild animals and their territory from rival herdsmen. They weren't just shepherds, they were warlords in training. They lived for the fight, for the thrill of the raid, for the spoils of victory. They were, through and through, the sons of Mars. Their reputation for boldness and violence grew. And it was this reputation that would ultimately bring them face to face with their past. During the festival of Lupercalia, a wild rustic festival of fertility, a fight broke out between the gang led by Romulus and Remus and the herdsmen of the deposed King Numitor. It was a bitter rivalry over grazing lands. In the ensuing brawl, Remus, always the more impulsive of the two, was captured. He was dragged not before the usurper Amulius, but before his own grandfather Numitor to answer for his crimes. As Numitor interrogated the defiant young man, he was struck by something. Remus carried himself not like a lowly shepherd, but with the pride and bearing of a king. His age matched the time his own grandsons had been lost. A seed of hope, long since buried, began to sprout in the old man's heart. Meanwhile, Faustulus, the shepherd who had raised them, knew the truth could no longer be hidden. He rushed to Romulus and told him everything: the basket, the river, the she-wolf, his suspicion that they were the lost grandsons of Numitor. The story clicked into place. The strange feeling of being different, the innate drive for leadership, the raw power that coursed through their veins. It all finally made sense. Fueled by this revelation, Romulus was no longer just a gang leader seeking to free his brother. He was a prince seeking to reclaim his throne. He rallied his band of shepherds, not with promises of loot, but with the promise of justice. They were no longer a rabble, they were an army of liberation. He armed his followers and marched on Alba Longa. The attack was swift and brutal. Romulus led one force that stormed the city gates, while Remus, having roused supporters from within the city, led another. They converged on the palace of Amulius. The usurper, who had lived for decades in fear of this very moment, was cornered. There was no trial, no negotiation. The sons of Mars, acting as judge, jury, and executioner, cut down their great-uncle, ending his tyranny with the cold, hard finality of steel. They freed their mother, Rhea Silvia, from her dungeon and presented themselves to their grandfather. The city erupted in celebration. Numitor was restored to his rightful throne, and his two grandsons, the boys who were meant to die in a river, were hailed as heroes. They had fulfilled the first part of their destiny. They had avenged their family and reclaimed their birthright. Now, standing on the banks of the Tiber, they looked to the 7 hills, ready to build an empire. But the blood that bound them as brothers was the same blood that would soon stain the foundations of the world's greatest city. For the sons of a war god, peace is never an option. The ambition that had united them in survival now threatened to tear them apart. 2 leaders, 2 visions, but only one throne. The 7 hills of their destiny became a chessboard, and the brothers, once inseparable, were now rival kings in a game for absolute power. The question was no longer where to build the city, but who would give it his name. Who would be its first king, its high priest, its lawgiver? The divine blood they shared, the very essence of Mars, demanded a victor. It demanded a conquest. And so they turned to the ancient ways, to the language of the gods, hoping for a sign that would settle their dispute without shattering their brotherhood. They agreed to an augury. They would each take a sacred post, Romulus on the Palatine Hill and Remus on the Aventine Hill, and there they would watch the skies. They would wait for the king of birds, the vulture, to deliver the verdict of Jupiter himself. It was a contest of divine favor, a trial by omen. The tension was suffocating. The silence of the hills was broken only by the wind whistling through the tall grass. For hours they waited, their eyes scanning the vast empty blue. Who would the gods choose? The patient strategist or the swift opportunist? Then a shout from the Aventine. Remus had seen them first. 6 magnificent vultures circling high above. Powerful omen. His men erupted in cheers. The gods had spoken. Remus was to be king. But as his celebration began, a second louder roar came from the Palatine. Romulus, calm and resolute, pointed to the sky. Not 6 but 12. A flight of 12 vultures, a number of immense power and finality, soared directly over his head. The dispute exploded into chaos. Who had truly won? Remus, who saw the birds first, claiming the primacy of the sign? Or Romulus, who saw the greater number, claiming the power of the sign? It was a paradox wrapped in a prophecy. The ambiguity of the gods became the fuel for mortal conflict. Their followers drew lines in the dirt, their loyalties hardening. The attempt to avoid bloodshed had only made it inevitable. The sons of Mars could not interpret a sign for peace. They could only see it as a challenge, a call to arms. The divine verdict hadn't chosen a king. It had chosen a battlefield. Ignoring the unresolved omen, or perhaps emboldened by his interpretation of it, Romulus began. He returned to the Palatine Hill, the site of his victorious sign, and with a bronze plowshare pulled by a white bull and a white cow, he carved a furrow into the earth. This was the Pomerium, the sacred boundary of his new city. This line was not merely a mark in the soil. It was a magical and religious barrier, a line separating the city from the untamed world, civilization from chaos, us from them. Within this line, order would reign. Outside, anything was possible. To cross this sacred furrow with hostile intent was the ultimate sacrilege, an act of war not just against the city, but against its gods. As Romulus and his followers began to build the first low wall of mud and stone along this line, Remus arrived, his heart a cocktail of jealousy and wounded pride. He watched his brother, the self-proclaimed king, laying the foundations of a city that should have been his. He scoffed at the pathetic little wall. To him, it was a monument to his brother's arrogance, a laughable defense. In a fateful act of mockery and defiance, Remus leaped over the half-built wall, contemptuously violating the sacred boundary. "Is this how you'll protect your city?" he sneered. "An enemy could cross it as easily as I." In that moment, something snapped in Romulus. It wasn't just a brother's insult. It was a fundamental attack on everything he was trying to create. It was a desecration. The law of the Pomerium had been broken at the very moment of its creation. The first challenge to Rome's authority had come not from a foreign enemy, but from within. The blood of Mars, the god of discipline, order, and brutal consequence, surged through Romulus's veins. There could be no exceptions. A law without a penalty is merely advice, and the penalty for violating the sacred heart of Rome had to be absolute. He turned, his face a mask of cold fury. The tool in his hand, some say a spade, others the sword he always carried, became an instrument of judgment. He struck his twin brother down. Remus fell, his blood soaking into the soil beside the very wall he had mocked. The first blood spilled in the new city was not that of an enemy, but of a brother. The foundation of Rome was not consecrated with wine or holy water, but with the ultimate sacrifice, fratricide. Standing over his brother's body, Romulus spoke words that would echo through the centuries, becoming the ironclad principle of Roman identity. "So shall it be for all who dare to cross my walls." It was a horrifying, brutal act, but in that moment Romulus ceased to be just a man. He became the embodiment of the Roman state, an entity for which no sacrifice was too great, no bond too sacred to break in the name of its own preservation and security. Family, friendship, even the life of his own twin, all were secondary to the survival and sanctity of Rome. The city was paramount. The state was a god. This was the first and most terrible law of Romulus. The cheers of his followers were hesitant, tainted by the horror of what they had just witnessed. But they saw the grim necessity in it. They saw the birth of an idea. This city, founded on a brother's blood, would be a city of unparalleled strength, a city that would not tolerate weakness or dissent. Romulus, now alone, was the undisputed king. He named the city after himself, Roma. But as he looked out from his blood-stained Palatine Hill, he saw a city of men. He had warriors, farmers, and followers, all drawn to his banner of absolute strength, but he had no future. A city of men is just an army camp, a temporary settlement destined to die out in a single generation. To build an empire, to create a legacy that would last 1,000 years, he needed more than walls and laws. He needed families. He needed children. He needed women. The neighboring tribes, like the Sabines, looked upon this new city of outcasts and runaways with suspicion and contempt. They were a rough, violent people, led by a man who had murdered his own brother. No father would willingly give his daughter in marriage to a Roman. Romulus sent envoys, proposing treaties and alliances through marriage. He was rejected, laughed at, and humiliated at every turn. They were told that perhaps they should open a sanctuary for female criminals and runaways, as that was the only way they would ever find wives worthy of them. The humiliation stung. But Romulus was not the son of a diplomat. He was the son of the god of war. And when diplomacy fails, a son of Mars knows only one other path. If wives could not be won through courtship, they would be taken by force. If the future of Rome could not be secured with treaties, it would be secured with the sword. A new plan began to form in his mind, a plan of audacious deception and brutal efficiency. He would host a great festival, a religious celebration in honor of the god Neptune, and he would invite all of Rome's neighbors to attend, promising games, feasting, and friendship. The Sabines and others, their guard lowered by the pretense of peace and piety, would come in droves, bringing their families, their wives, and their unmarried daughters to witness the spectacle. They had no idea they were walking into a trap, and that Romulus's city of bachelors was about to solve its population crisis in the most Roman way imaginable. The festival of Consus was in full swing. The air, thick with the scent of roasted meats and spilled wine, echoed with the roar of the crowd as chariot races thundered around a makeshift track. The Sabines, lulled by the boisterous hospitality and the shared spectacle, felt a sense of kinship with these rugged men of the new city. They saw ambition, yes, but they also saw a potential ally, a future trading partner. Their daughters, cloaked in the finest linen their families could afford, watched the games with wide, curious eyes, perhaps even catching the glance of a handsome Roman soldier or a wealthy landowner. They were guests of honor. They were safe. Romulus watched from his seat of prominence, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He wasn't watching the chariots. He was watching his men, scattered strategically throughout the crowd. Each one knew his role. Each one had his target. This wasn't a festival. It was a battlefield, and the operation was about to begin. As the final chariot crossed the finish line and the crowd erupted in a climactic cheer, Romulus rose to his feet. He gathered his purple-bordered toga, the symbol of his authority, and in a single deliberate motion, he let it fall from his shoulders. It was the signal. Instantly, the celebration shattered. The cheering died in 1,000 throats, replaced by gasps and then screams. The Roman men, acting as one, lunged. They weren't grabbing indiscriminately. This was no mindless riot. It was a coordinated military-style seizure. They bypassed the married women, ignored the elderly. They went for the prize, the young unmarried daughters of the Sabines. A father who tried to shield his child was thrown to the ground. A brother who raised his fists was met with the crushing blow of a pommel. The Sabines had come for a party. The Romans had come for a harvest. Chaos reigned, but it was a controlled chaos. The Romans, sons of the war god, moved with brutal efficiency. They hoisted the struggling, terrified women onto their shoulders and began to retreat towards the fortified parts of the city, their comrades forming a cordon to block any pursuit. The Sabine men, caught completely off guard, unarmed and in disarray, could do nothing but watch in horror and fury as their daughters, their sisters, their future, were carried away like spoils of war. Their cries of outrage were drowned out by the disciplined shouts of the Romans. They were herded, pushed, and driven from the city limits, their fists bloodied, their pride in tatters, the screams of their stolen women echoing in their ears. As the city gates slammed shut, a dreadful silence fell over Rome. Inside, nearly 700 Sabine women were now captive. They were huddled together, weeping, terrified, their fine clothes torn, their hair disheveled. They were prisoners in the very city that had welcomed them as guests just hours before. And then Romulus appeared before them. He wasn't flanked by brutish soldiers. He approached alone, his expression not of a triumphant conqueror, but of a solemn statesman. He knew that what came next was more critical than the abduction itself. He could rule them by fear, but a city built on terror would eventually consume itself. He needed to win them over. He needed to turn captives into citizens, into wives, into mothers. He began to speak, his voice resonating with the authority of a king and the passion of a zealot. He didn't apologize. He explained. He told them this was not an act of lust, but of necessity. He spoke of his city's destiny, a destiny ordained by the gods, a future that required a new generation. He told them their own fathers had been short-sighted, denying Rome the alliances and the families it needed to survive, blinded by their fear of Rome's potential. He argued that this desperate act was the only way to secure the city's future, a future they would now share. He looked them in the eyes one by one and made them a promise. He promised they would not be treated as slaves or property. They would be honored wives, partners in building this great new civilization. Their children, he proclaimed, would be born free citizens, heirs to all the wealth and glory that Rome was destined to achieve. They would be the matriarchs of the greatest noble houses the world would ever know. He appealed to their pride, telling them that while the injury was great, their anger should be directed at their fathers, who had refused a peaceful union. Now he offered them a different kind of union, one forged in crisis but destined for greatness. An injury, he told them, is often followed by affection. You will find your husbands to be all the kinder, because each of us will be doing his utmost to make up for the loss of your parents and your homeland. It was an audacious, almost insane argument. He was asking them to accept their captors as their saviors. And yet, the Roman historians tell us that in the end, his words began to find their mark. Perhaps it was the sheer force of his conviction. Perhaps it was the grim realization of their circumstances. Or perhaps, in the promises of status, citizenship, and a stake in a glorious future, they saw a better path than the one they had lost. The violence of the act was undeniable, but Romulus was offering them a place at the center of power, not on the margins. They would be the mothers of Rome, the mothers of conquerors, the mothers of kings. While Romulus was transforming victims into founders, the news of the outrage was spreading like wildfire through the Sabine lands. The men who had straggled back, humiliated and defeated, told their story. and the Sabine people responded with a single unified cry of pure rage. This was more than a kidnapping. It was a profound insult to their honor, a declaration of war on their very bloodline. Their king, Titus Tatius, a veteran warrior with a reputation for cold, calculating fury, listened to the reports, his knuckles white as he gripped the arms of his throne. He didn't need to rally his people. Their blood was already boiling. Messengers were dispatched. Banners were unfurled. Blacksmiths worked through the night, the clang of hammers on steel a promise of the vengeance to come. The Sabines weren't just assembling an army to punish a rogue city. They were embarking on a holy crusade to reclaim their stolen daughters and to wipe this arrogant, wolf-suckled city of Rome from the face of the earth. The die was cast. The first great war in Roman history was inevitable. Romulus had secured the future of Rome's population, but in doing so, he had guaranteed a battle for its very survival. The sons of Mars had won the first round through treachery and brute force. Now they would have to prove they could win the second on the battlefield, against a hardened, disciplined army marching under a single banner: revenge. The Sabine legions were gathering, their spears sharpened, their hearts filled with a righteous hatred. They were coming for their daughters, and they were coming for blood. And Rome, the fledgling city of outcasts and runaways, was utterly unprepared. The bravado that had filled the air during the festival now curdled into a cold, creeping dread. These weren't rival shepherds they had bested in a brawl. This was a nation, a people whose honor they had stolen along with their daughters. The men looked at their new wives, the Sabine women, and for the first time, they saw not just the promise of a future, but the specter of a bloody reckoning. They saw the faces of the fathers they had defied, the brothers they had humiliated. The Sabine king, Titus Tatius, was no fool. He didn't rush headlong into a single decisive battle. He was methodical, patient, and filled with a cold fury. He first laid siege to the smaller Latin towns allied with Rome, crushing them one by one, isolating the city on its 7 hills, letting the fear build. With each victory, the Sabine army swelled, their confidence growing, their discipline hardening. They were a tightening noose around Rome's neck. Inside the walls, Romulus scrambled to forge an army from a mob. He organized his followers into legions, appointing centurions, instilling a desperate discipline. But training takes time, and time was a luxury they did not have. The first clashes were disastrous. The Romans fought with the ferocity of cornered animals, but the Sabines fought with the cold precision of a military machine. Roman formations broke. Men who had been farmers and fugitives just weeks before were cut down by warriors who had trained for this their entire lives. The fighting surged to the very gates of the city. The Sabines, led by a fearsome warrior named Medius Curtius, pushed the Romans back through the Forum, back towards the steep slopes of the Palatine Hill, the very heart of Rome. The Roman lines buckled, then broke completely. It was a rout. Men threw down their shields and ran for their lives, their city, their dream, collapsing behind them. And in that moment of absolute despair, with his men fleeing and his city about to be overrun, Romulus the king, the son of a god, did the only thing he could. He raised his hands to the heavens, his voice raw with desperation, and he prayed. But he didn't pray to his father, Mars. In this moment of retreat, of failure, to call upon the god of war felt like a mockery. Instead, he prayed to the king of the gods, Jupiter. He vowed that if Jupiter would halt the shameful retreat of his people, if he would give them the courage to stand and fight, he would build a great temple on that very spot. A temple to Jupiter Stator, Jupiter the Stayer. And as the legend tells it, a miracle happened. It was as if a divine hand had reached down and grabbed hold of the fleeing Romans. They stopped, their panic-stricken flight arrested in mid-stride. They turned shamefaced to see their king Romulus standing alone, his sword held high, facing the entire Sabine army. He was a lightning rod of defiance. Inspired by his stand, or perhaps by the will of a god, they reformed their lines. The retreat was over. The battle for Rome's soul had just begun. Romulus, now filled with a divine fury, plunged back into the fray. He sought out the Sabine champion Medius Curtius, who was bogged down in marshy ground. The two leaders clashed in a furious duel, but it was Romulus, channeling the strength of his divine father, who prevailed. The Sabines, seeing their champion fall back, faltered. The tide of the battle began to turn. The fighting became a brutal, grinding stalemate in the valley between the hills, a bloody pit where the future of Italy was being decided, sword stroke by sword stroke. For days the battle raged. Neither side could gain a decisive advantage. The ground became slick with the blood of both Romans and Sabines. The air was thick with the screams of the dying and the clash of steel. And then something happened that no one could have predicted. Something that would change the course of history, not through the sword but through the heart. From the gates of Rome a procession emerged. It wasn't an army. It was the Sabine women, the very cause of the war. Their hair was torn, their clothes were in disarray, but they marched with a terrifying resolve. In their arms, they carried the infants they had borne to their Roman husbands. They were no longer just captives, they were wives and mothers. They marched directly into the no-man's land between the two armies, a human shield of love and despair. The fighting sputtered to a halt. Soldiers on both sides lowered their weapons, staring in stunned disbelief. One of the women, Hersilia, the wife of Romulus himself, stepped forward. She faced the Sabine army, her people, her family. "Fathers, brothers," she cried, her voice ringing across the silent battlefield. "You came here to punish the men who wronged us, but in doing so, you will make us widows and orphans in a single day. You will cover yourselves in the blood of your sons-in-law and your own grandsons." Then she turned to the Romans. "Husbands, you have shown us kindness and love. But if you must fight, if you must prove your honor, then turn your swords on us. For it is better for us to die than to live without one of you as widows or as orphans. We are the cause of this war. Let us be its end." Her words struck the armies like a thunderbolt. The men looked from the women to the infants in their arms, and then at the enemy across the field. The Sabines saw not just their stolen daughters, but the mothers of their grandchildren. The Romans saw not just their wives, but the women who were pleading for the lives of their own fathers and brothers. The righteous hatred that had fueled the war began to dissolve, replaced by a profound and aching sorrow. The absurdity of it all crashed down upon them. They were about to slaughter each other, to destroy two families, two peoples, who were now bound by the most sacred ties of all, the ties of blood. Slowly, a Sabine warrior dropped his spear. Then another. A Roman lowered his shield. Soon, the entire valley floor was littered with discarded weapons. King Tatius and King Romulus walked to the center of the field. They didn't speak of surrender or victory. They spoke of peace. They spoke of union. The raw, primal act of theft that had started this war had, in a strange and brutal way, forged a bond that could not be broken. The war ended not with a treaty, but with an embrace. And this is the moment that truly defines the Roman spirit, a spirit born from the blood of Mars and the tears of the Sabine women. Rome didn't just defeat its enemy, it absorbed them. The Sabines packed up their homes and moved to Rome. The two peoples became one. Titus Tatius and Romulus agreed to rule together as joint kings, doubling the city's strength, its wisdom, and its population overnight. This became the Roman way. To conquer was not to destroy, but to incorporate, to turn a bitter enemy into a loyal citizen. It was a strategy of assimilation that would allow a tiny city-state to one day rule the known world. The brutal pragmatism of Mars had been tempered by the unifying power of family. Peace had been achieved through the courage of women and the wisdom of men. Two peoples became one. But Rome was a city forged in the heart of a wolf, fathered by the god of war himself. And in such a city, there is only ever room for one king. The pact was sealed not in ink but in blood and vows. Romulus the Roman and Titus Tatius, the Sabine, now ruled as equals from two thrones. On the surface, it was a masterstroke of diplomacy. The Romans, with their raw, untamed energy, were now fused with the Sabines, a people of ancient wealth and established traditions. The city's population doubled overnight. Its strength, in theory, had doubled as well. But power, like a kingdom, cannot be truly shared. It can be divided, it can be balanced for a time, but in the end it always seeks a single master. The two kings ruled from different hills, a constant, silent reminder of their separate origins. Romulus from the Palatine, the hill of the wolf's den. Tatius from the Capitoline, the new home of the Sabines. For a few years a fragile peace held. They established a common calendar, they integrated their religious rites, and they created the first 100 senators, the patres, the fathers of the city. But beneath this veneer of cooperation, a cultural war was brewing. The Romans saw the Sabines as soft, obsessed with gold and quiet living. The Sabines saw the Romans as little more than jumped-up bandits, violent and unpredictable. men who had stolen their daughters. Every shared decree, every joint sacrifice was a negotiation. Two different visions for Rome were locked in a cold war. Romulus envisioned a city of warriors, a predator state destined to dominate its neighbors, a perfect reflection of his divine father. Tatius dreamed of a city of commerce and stability, a regional power built on wealth, not bloodshed. It was an unsustainable duality. Mars had not sired a son to be a co-pilot. He had sired a king. And the god of war would not be denied his champion. The breaking point when it came was not over land or treasure but over justice. A group of ambassadors from the neighboring city of Lavinium arrived in Rome to plead a case before the kings. But before they could be heard, they were assaulted and robbed on the street. The culprits? Relatives of King Tatius. The Lavinians were outraged. This was more than a simple mugging. It was a violation of sacred law. Ambassadors were sacrosanct, their safety guaranteed by the gods themselves. They demanded the perpetrators be handed over for punishment. Romulus agreed immediately. To him the matter was simple. A law had been broken, an insult delivered. Justice demanded a swift and brutal response. Failure to act would be seen as weakness, an invitation for every other city to disrespect Rome. But Tatius hesitated. These were his kinsmen, his people. He argued for leniency, made excuses, and ultimately refused to surrender them. He chose blood over honor, family over the law of nations. In that moment, the fracture between the two kings became a chasm. Romulus was disgusted. This was the weakness he had always suspected in his Sabine counterpart. A true king, a son of Mars, would know that the state is everything. The law is everything. Personal feelings are a luxury a ruler cannot afford. Tatius, by protecting his criminal relatives, had not only endangered Rome by inviting the wrath of its neighbors, but he had also proven himself unfit to rule a city of warriors. The gods, it seemed, agreed. When Tatius later traveled to Lavinium to perform a public sacrifice, hoping to smooth things over with ceremony instead of justice, he was recognized. The families of the wronged ambassadors, denied justice in Rome, decided to claim it for themselves. As Tatius stood at the altar, a mob descended upon him. They didn't use swords or spears. They beat him to death with the heavy sacrificial spits they carried. It was a brutal, undignified end for a king. News of his death reached Rome, and the city held its breath. Would Romulus avenge his co-ruler? Would he march on Lavinium and burn it to the ground for the murder of a Roman king? The Sabines demanded it, but Romulus's response shocked everyone. He did nothing. He declared that Tatius had gotten what he deserved. An eye for an eye. The crime of Tatius's relatives had been answered by the murder of Tatius himself. The books were balanced. The matter was closed. It was a chillingly pragmatic decision, and a masterful political move. With one stroke, Romulus avoided a costly war with a powerful neighbor and rid himself of his only rival. Some whispered that Romulus had orchestrated the whole thing, that he had secretly encouraged the Lavinians to take their revenge, knowing it was the cleanest way to dissolve the dual monarchy. We will never know for sure. But what we do know is that from that day forward, there was only one throne in Rome. And Romulus, the son of Mars, sat upon it alone. Now he was unbound. The full, ferocious ambition of his divine heritage was unleashed upon Italy. For the next 30 years, Romulus's reign was one of almost constant warfare. He was no longer just a king. He was a warlord, the living embodiment of Mars Gradivus, the god who strides into battle. He taught the Romans that their natural state was conquest. Peace was merely the time you spent sharpening your sword for the next war. He first turned his attention to Fidene, a town that had grown insolent, raiding Roman territory. Romulus didn't just defeat their army in the field. He used trickery, a tactic his father would have appreciated. He staged a fake retreat, luring the army of Fidene out from behind their walls, and then crushed them with a hidden force of cavalry. He annexed their land not as a conqueror, but as a farmer planting a new crop. He was planting Romans. Next came the mighty Etruscan city of Veii, a true regional power. They looked at the upstart city of Rome with contempt and demanded the return of Fidene. Romulus's response was to march his army to their gates. The war with Veii lasted for years, a grinding, bloody affair that tested Rome to its limits. But Romulus, and the spirit of Mars within him, never faltered. He led from the front, his red cloak a banner of war on the battlefield. He drove the Veientines back again and again, stripping them of their territory piece by piece, forcing upon them a humiliating 100-year truce. He didn't just defeat them, he broke their pride. With every victory, Rome grew. But Romulus knew that an empire is not built on victories alone. It needs a spine. It needs institutions. And so, he became a builder, a lawgiver, the embodiment of Mars Quirinus, the protector of the civic order. He organized the entire Roman population into 3 tribes and 30 curiae, not just for administrative purposes, but to create a system for levying soldiers. Every Roman citizen was, first and foremost, a warrior in waiting. He established the legions. Not the professional machine of later centuries, but its terrifying prototype. 3 legions of 3,000 infantry and 300 cavalry each. A force of nearly 10,000 men, a staggering number for the time, all sworn to the defense and expansion of Rome. He created his own personal bodyguard, 300 of the finest young warriors in the city, called the Sellers, the Swift Ones. They were his enforcers, his honor guard, his instrument of absolute will. He solidified the role of the Senate, the council of elders he had created with Tatius. But under his sole rule, their role changed. They were not his equals. They were his advisors, the repository of Roman tradition, but the final decision, the decision of war and peace, was always his. He was the wolf, and they were the wise old owls of the forest. They could offer counsel, but they could not command the hunt. For decades, Romulus was the perfect king for a city born of violence. He was a conqueror abroad and a stern father at home. He gave his people laws, a sense of identity, and most importantly, victory. He took a refugee camp on a hill and forged it into the most feared city in Latium. He had fulfilled his father's grandest design. But as the years wore on, something began to change. The man who had been raised by a wolf began to act less like a shepherd of his people, and more like a predator among them. Power, held for so long, began to curdle into arrogance. He started wearing robes of purple, the color of absolute monarchy. His Sellers became less of a bodyguard and more of a private gang, intimidating his critics. He began to ignore the Senate, ruling by decree, as if he were already a god. He had built a city of warriors, but he was forgetting that warriors value strength, not tyranny. He had created a Senate of proud men, and he was forgetting that pride does not bow easily. The whispers started in the darkened corners of the Senate house. Romulus had grown too powerful. He had become a danger to the very city he had built. He was the son of a god, but he was ruling like a despot. And in Rome, a city that would one day build a republic on the corpse of a king, there is no greater crime. The storm clouds were gathering over the Palatine Hill, and the very men who had followed him into battle were now sharpening their knives in the shadows. The fury of the Senate was a quiet thing, a poison seeping into the foundations of the city. It wasn't the wild, chaotic rage of a mob. It was the cold, calculated anger of powerful men who felt their power slipping away. Romulus, the boy raised by a wolf, the man who had carved a city out of nothing, had forgotten a fundamental rule of power. You never let your allies feel like subjects. He had divided the spoils of war by himself, ignoring the Senate's counsel. He had appointed his own personal guard, a legion of 300 men called the Sellers, who answered only to him. He was acting less like the first among equals and more like a foreign despot, an Etruscan tyrant. The senators, the patres, the fathers of the Roman families whose lineage was meant to be the bedrock of the state, were being reduced to mere advisors, their voices drowned out by the king's singular ambition. They saw the ghost of Remus in everything he did. Every decree that bypassed their authority, every new law enacted without their consent, was another swing of the shovel on their brother's grave. Romulus had shown them he was willing to kill his own blood for the sake of power. Why would they, men bound to him only by oath and circumstance, be any different? They had helped him build Rome, but now they feared he was building his own cage around them. And so, in the shadowed halls of their villas and in the quiet corners of the Forum, they began to whisper. They reminded each other that it was they, the patricians, who were the true heart of Rome, not one man, not even the son of a god. The whispers grew into a plan, a dark consensus forged in fear and resentment. They would not wait for the king to become a tyrant. They would act first. The day it happened began like any other day of triumph. It was the nones of Quintilis, the seventh day of what would one day be called July. Romulus called an assembly on the Campus Martius, the field of Mars, his father's sacred ground. He was reviewing his troops, addressing the people, a king in his prime, standing tall amidst the city he had willed into existence. He was 37 years into his reign, a living legend, his hair now streaked with gray but his eyes still burning with divine fire. He wore his purple-bordered toga, the symbol of his authority, a stark splash of color against the dusty field. The sun beat down, the standards of the legions glinted, and the people of Rome looked upon their founder with awe. He was their protector, their lawgiver, their connection to the gods. He seemed untouchable, immortal. Then the sky turned on him. Without warning, a storm of impossible violence erupted. It wasn't a normal summer squall. The heavens ripped open. The sun vanished behind a churning mass of black clouds. A howling gale swept across the field, tearing at tents and blinding the soldiers with dust. Thunder, so loud it felt like the sky was cracking apart, shook the very ground. Lightning didn't just flash. It tore through the air in blinding, jagged sheets. It was a storm of divine rage, a supernatural tempest that seemed to target the very spot where the king stood. The common people, terrified, broke ranks and fled, seeking shelter in their homes, believing the gods themselves were descending in wrath. The Campus Martius emptied in moments, the panicked cries of the citizens swallowed by the roaring wind. When the chaos subsided, only Romulus and the senators remained, shrouded in the eerie darkness of the storm. And it was there, in the heart of the tempest, on the sacred field of his own father, that the king of Rome vanished from the face of the earth. What happened in those few frantic moments has been debated for 2,000 years, a mystery wrapped in a legend. The senators had a story, of course, a story they told with wide, earnest eyes to the terrified populace who emerged from their homes after the storm had passed. They claimed that as the thunder crashed, a fiery chariot, pulled by horses of shadow and flame, had descended from the heavens. Mars himself had come for his son. They watched, they swore, as Romulus was lifted from the earth, his mortal form dissolving into light, ascending into the sky to take his place among the gods. It was not a death, they insisted, but an apotheosis, a divine assumption. Romulus the king was gone, but Quirinus the god was born. It was a beautiful story, a powerful story. It transformed a potential crisis into a moment of profound religious significance. It assured the people that their founder was now their divine protector, watching over them from on high. It was a story that made Rome special, a city whose very founder was a deity. But there was another story, a darker story whispered in the taverns and alleys, a story that never quite went away. This version claimed there was no chariot, no divine father. There was only the storm, the chaos, and the cold steel of daggers. In this telling, the senators used the cover of the supernatural storm for a very human act of butchery. They surrounded their king, the man who had grown too powerful, and they fell upon him. There, in the mud and the driving rain, the fathers of Rome murdered the father of Rome. But a body would be proof of their treason. So, in an act of horrific pragmatism, they did the unspeakable. They dismembered him. Each senator, a conspirator in the bloody pact, concealed a piece of the king's body beneath his toga and slipped away from the scene, one by one, to dispose of the evidence. They literally scattered their king to the winds, ensuring no trace of him, no tomb, no shrine to a murdered hero would ever be found. The city was a powder keg. The common people and the soldiers, who had loved Romulus, did not readily accept the senator's tale of a heavenly chariot. They saw the fear and the guilt in the eyes of the patricians. They accused them of regicide, of murdering their king. The forum buzzed with angry mobs, and the fragile peace of the new city was about to shatter into civil war. The Senate's conspiracy had succeeded in eliminating the king, but it was about to fail in controlling the aftermath. And then a miracle, or perhaps a masterful piece of political theater. A respected nobleman named Proculus Julius, a man known for his sober judgment and integrity, rushed into the forum, his face filled with a holy terror and awe. He demanded an audience and swore a sacred oath. He told the crowd that as he was traveling on the road, a vision had appeared to him. It was Romulus, but not the Romulus he knew. This figure was taller, more majestic, clad in gleaming armor, radiating a divine light. It was Romulus as the god Quirinus. Proculus claimed the divine Romulus had spoken to him. "Go. the apparition commanded. "And tell the Romans that the gods have willed that my Rome shall be the capital of the world. Let them henceforth cultivate the arts of war. And let them know and teach their children that no human power can withstand the arms of Rome." With those words, the vision had ascended back into the heavens. The speech had an electric effect. Proculus was a trusted man. The message itself was intoxicating, a divine prophecy that spoke directly to the ambition and pride of the Roman people. It was exactly what they wanted to believe. Their king wasn't murdered. He was a god. Their city wasn't just a settlement. It was a destiny. The anger of the crowd subsided, replaced by a wave of religious fervor and patriotic zeal. The crisis was averted. The senator's version of the story was now sanctified by a divine messenger. Whether Proculus Julius actually saw a vision, or whether he was a shrewd political actor paid by the senators to sell a lie, we will never know. But his story became the official history. The cult of Quirinus was established, and Romulus, the son of Mars, became the first and only Roman to achieve godhood through his own merit. His end, violent and mysterious, was the perfect capstone to a life born of violence and mystery. Whether he was torn apart by men or taken by a god, the outcome was the same. The raw, untamed, personal power of the son of Mars was extinguished. But in its place, the spirit of Mars was permanently fused into the city's DNA. The ambition, the discipline, the ruthlessness, the divine mandate for conquest, these were no longer the traits of one man. They now belonged to the state. Romulus was gone. The son of Mars had vanished from the earth, either taken to the heavens or torn apart by the very men he had elevated. But in his place, something new and terrifying was born. A city no longer ruled by a king, but by an ideal forged in blood, legitimized by a god, and hungry for the world. The age of kings was over. The age of the Republic and the true reign of Mars was about to begin. The Roman Republic was an engine, and its fuel was war. For 500 years, the gates of the Temple of Janus, which stood open in times of conflict, were almost never closed. This wasn't the desperate struggle for survival of Romulus's time. This was a systematic, relentless, and sacred mission of expansion. Every year, the consuls, the two elected leaders of the Republic, would take the auspices, march out to the field of Mars, and lead the legions to battle. War was no longer a seasonal crisis. It was the central function of the state. It was how a Roman man earned his dignity, his dignitas. It was how the city earned its wealth. And it was how the world would learn the meaning of fear. At the heart of this engine was the Roman legion. Not just an army, but a near-perfect embodiment of the Martian ideal. It was a machine of disciplined violence, where the individual was subsumed into the collective. The legionary was a farmer, a citizen, a voter, but when he put on his helmet and took up his gladius, he became a priest of Mars. He swore an oath, the sacramentum, that bound his very life to the eagle standard of his legion. This wasn't just a flag. It was a sacred icon, a vessel for the legion's soul. To lose it was the ultimate disgrace, a sin against the god of war himself. On the march, they were engineers building roads and bridges that would stand for millennia. In camp, they were architects constructing fortified cities overnight. And in battle, they were a meat grinder. The terrifying rhythmic stamp of thousands of hobnailed sandals, the sky-shattering cry of "For the Senate and people of Rome," and the cold, professional efficiency with which they dismantled their enemies. This was Mars Gradivus, the strider made manifest in iron and sinew. And when these men returned victorious, Rome put on the greatest show on earth, the triumph. This was more than a parade. It was a religious and political spectacle designed to awe the world. The victorious general, the triumphator, would ride in a chariot, his face painted red to emulate the terracotta statue of Jupiter, and some say of Mars himself. A slave would stand behind him, holding a golden crown above his head, whispering in his ear, "Remember, you are mortal." Before him paraded the spoils of war, gold, art, exotic animals, and the captured kings and queens, now reduced to chains and destined for a dungeon or a public execution. Behind him marched his legions, roaring his name, singing ribald songs, their bloodlust temporarily sated. The entire city would turn out, a sea of humanity screaming their approval. This was the ultimate validation. This was the reward for faithful service to Mars. It was a promise to every Roman citizen. This glory, this wealth, this power can be yours, if you are willing to bleed for it. This worship of war became the Republic's undoing. The system that created the legions eventually created men who were too powerful for the system to contain. Generals like Marius and Sulla began to command a loyalty from their troops that superseded loyalty to the state. The legions became private armies, their eagle standard symbols not of Rome, but of their commander. The citizen soldier, who fought for his farm and his city, was replaced by the professional soldier, who fought for the man who promised him land and gold. The Republic had raised generations of wolves, and now the wolves were turning on each other. The civil wars that tore the Republic apart were a titanic, bloody contest between the greatest disciples of Mars the world had ever seen, Pompey the great conqueror of the East, and his rival, his former ally Gaius Julius Caesar. Caesar was perhaps the ultimate Martian avatar, a brilliant strategist, a ruthless politician, and a man who inspired a fanatical devotion in his legions. When he crossed the Rubicon River with the 13th Legion, bringing his army onto Italian soil in defiance of the Senate, he wasn't just starting a civil war. He was performing a profound act of religious blasphemy and devotion all at once. He was taking the sacred instrument of Mars, the Legion, and turning it against Mars's own city. The die, as he famously said, was cast. The Republic died in the bloodbath that followed. From its ashes rose one man, Caesar's adopted son Octavian, who would soon be known by another name, Augustus, the first Roman emperor. And Augustus, a political genius, understood that to rule Rome, you needed more than just armies. You needed a story. You needed the gods on your side. He couldn't simply declare himself king. That word was still poison in Rome. So he became the princeps, the first citizen. And he embarked on a massive propaganda campaign to legitimize his new regime. His key partner in this project, Mars. In the heart of his new forum, Augustus built a magnificent temple, not just to Mars but to Mars' altar, Mars the Avenger. The divine justification was clear. He was avenging the murder of his father, Julius Caesar, a sacred duty. But the political message was even clearer. I am the one who brings justice. I am the one who punishes the wicked. I am the chosen agent of divine retribution. The military standards that had been humiliatingly lost to the Parthians were recovered and placed in this temple. It was a declaration to the world. The shame of the Republic is over. The glory of the Empire, under my watch and Mars's protection, has begun. Mars was no longer just the father of the Roman people. He was now the personal guardian of the emperor and the guarantor of the New World Order, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. A peace, it should be noted, that was maintained by the constant, looming threat of the most powerful military machine on the planet. For centuries, Mars remained at the heart of Roman identity. He was on the coins in their pockets, his temples were in every major city, and his name was invoked before every battle. But empires, like men, are mortal. As Rome began its long, slow decline, a new faith rose from the east. A faith that spoke not of martial glory, but of humility. Not of conquest, but of compassion. Not of a god of war, but of a prince of peace. When the Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity, the tide had turned forever. The temples of Mars were closed, his statues torn down. The god who had birthed Rome, who had guided its legions and defined its soul for 1,000 years, was officially retired. But did he ever really leave? His name is embedded in our calendar. In the month of March, the ancient start of the campaigning season. His spirit lives in our language in words like martial, but his true legacy is far deeper and far more unsettling. The Roman idea, the Martian idea, that war is a noble instrument of the state, that military power is the ultimate measure of a nation's greatness, and that peace is something to be imposed through dominance, that idea never died. It outlived the empire. It has been picked up, repurposed, and redeployed by countless nations and leaders throughout history. The armor has changed, the eagle standards have been replaced by new flags, but the archetype remains. The ghost of Mars still walks the corridors of power. He whispers in the ears of presidents and generals, promising security through strength and glory through conflict. The Romans were just the first to perfect his worship on a global scale. They were the first to show the world what happens when a nation gives its entire heart, its entire soul, to the god of war. And we, their distant descendants, still live in the world they built, under the long cold shadow of Mars.